Welcome to a special two-part series of Sacred Stories of the Spirit, exploring what happens when a cultural story reaches a threshold, when a ritual that once shaped a sense of belonging starts to feel out of step with who we are and who we've become. So all cultures have stories that tell us who we are, what we value, and what it means to belong. And sometimes we forget that they're stories. They run so deep that they just become muscle memory. Then occasionally we see something shift and they don't feel right anymore. These stories don't fit comfortably in the way that perhaps they used to. This is the threshold moment that is so important for us to witness and participate in. We recognise it perhaps not just because we think it through, but because we can feel it. This is often an embodied experience of sensing that something just doesn't land the way that it used to. It doesn't feel right anymore. So my name's Jordan Harcourt Hughes, and this is about learning to meet those threshold moments consciously. And looking at stories not just on a personal level, but on a systems level as well. You'll connect with this series if you're interested in how stories operate as vessels of belonging and how we can evolve them without erasing the people that inherited them. We're using the Melbourne Cup as a case study. We're not looking at it just as a sporting event, but a long-standing cultural ritual that reveals how a story becomes enmeshed in national identity, how it stays protected, and what happens when it starts to loosen. So let's begin the conversation in part one. The old story, how rituals become untouchable. To really understand why the Melbourne Cup has held such emotional weight for so long, we really need to see it the way culture sees it, as a symbol of collective identity. My first guests in this conversation are Professor Catherine Lumby from the discipline of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney, and Professor David Rowe, Emeritus Professor of Cultural Research at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. Their work can help us to understand how national rituals become carriers of belonging, not just because everyone individually chooses them, but because repetition becomes memory and memory becomes meaning. When something's been embedded for long enough, questioning it can feel like questioning the culture itself, which is why rituals like the Melbourne Cup often sit beyond critique for so long, even when they're quietly drifting out of alignment with our contemporary values. Well, David and Catherine, thank you so much for joining me today. It's really, really lovely to have you here for the conversation.
Pleasure.
Now, we're talking about the Spring Racing Carnival and the Melbourne Cup, and we're talking about this idea that the Melbourne Cup was a sacred Australian narrative, but is potentially now shifting. And so I'm really interested to explore that with you both. Are we still a race that is stopped by this race every year? Do we stop to party, to celebrate, to drink, to gamble, or are things shifting? And what does it say about us as a culture and society in terms of where we are with that relationship? But first of all, I'd really like to start with welcoming you and asking you to share with me a few things. So perhaps, Catherine, we'll start with you. Tell me about what you love about your work to start with.
Well, what I love about my work, well, I don't love universities and bureaucracy, but I love people. I love mentoring. I love supervising PhD students, teaching young people, and I love writing books. Yeah, so I'm in a job where that's allegedly what I'm paid to do, but universities are gigantic bureaucracies these days.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. And David, what do you love about your work?
Well, I mean, I'm an emeritus professor, which means I'm not on the payroll anymore. So I do it for love. And it's, I suppose it comes back. I think it's been an enormous privilege for me, sort of coming from working class background to kind of make it into this kind of impeccably what regarded as middle class space.
Yeah.
And then be able to be a sociologist and generate ideas and learn and keep learning. And as Catherine suggests, communicating with other people, all generations.
Yes.
And some just general sense I've got that I'm contributing to informed citizenship.
Brilliant. I love that. And now I'm pleased to have you both as academics and experts in your own right, but also you know each other. You've worked in the same space and know of each other's areas of expertise, which I think is wonderful as well. So for my first point, Catherine, what are your reflections on the Spring Racing Carnival in Australia and particularly the Melbourne Cup? And where do you think we are in 2025 in terms of both tradition and change?
Well, I might just start with a little backstory.
Yeah.
Like David, I come from a very working class background.
Yeah.
And both of my grandfathers were bookmakers. One of them was an on-course bookie. So that meant he took his leather bag. He was kind of lower middle class grandfather.
Yes.
And, and his little ledger, and he'd take the bets on the course, come home and tally them all up. The other grandfather, he was a dock worker who, worked the hungry mile in Sydney during the Depression. And my grandmother was a barmaid on the docks. And I used to be there on the weekends, and he'd
Yes.
be down the Bennett Hotel. He was an SP bookie. That means it was illegal what he was doing. My nana, would take the bets on the phone and note them down in an exercise book. And when I was about 7 or 8, I'd be running down to the Bennett Hotel, giving him the book to look at.
Yep.
And taking more bets back to my nana. So I had and I remember the cops arriving sometimes, and we'd have to run up to the back shed and hide. My exposure to gambling was really that it was a very blokey culture.
Yes.
It involved a lot of drinking, and it was, a very male activity. And, that goes way back in settler colonial Australian culture.
Yes.
That blokey stuff. So, if we move from that kind of framing of what gambling is about, I think today we're in a late capitalist, hyper-consumerist framework for thinking about gambling. I mean, there are gambling apps and ads everywhere, sports saturated with it. And I think that there's been there's the beginnings of a real pushback against that. And, gambling addiction is a very serious problem in Australia.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. One of the things I know that you've done a lot of work in is looking at gender dynamics. And I'm interested in what you think. When I think of how women have been invited to be present in the Spring Racing Carnival and the Melbourne Cup, it has really been as a performance scenario where women get dressed up. They're encouraged to think about being pretty, to invest in caring about fashion, and to be there on the side, really. What do you think of this idea that women have been treated as bait for things like the racing ones in Australia?
The first thing I want to say is I've got no problem with women dolling themselves up,
Yeah.
whatever that means to them. That's all
Yeah.
cool to me.
Yeah.
I don't mind aesthetics or, sexuality for that matter. But I've got to say, when I lived in Randwick, where the race course is, I used to get pretty amused, drive by or walk by it, midday when they're all going in, the women in their gorgeous starched frocks with their fascinators in their high heels, and they're all looking really fresh. And then, if you wandered past to pick the kids up from school about 4 o'clock, they're all like carrying their heels, and they're like this. They've got grass stains down the back of their dress. It's, so, one of the things I've observed is some of the women hook into the drinking and numerous other substances, I would imagine, these days. But yes, it is true. Conventionally, women have been encouraged to be the kind of bait, as you put it, the kind of decorative bait, and a way of, I suppose, dressing up what is really a big piss-up fest and a gambling fest into something more glamorous. It makes it more acceptable, I suppose. But underneath it, it's still, my granddad Pat at the Bennett Hotel, or my Nana Ev serving the drunk men at the Crito Hotel on the docks where they're gambling. So, I mean, it's just a veneer, really. It's a class-created veneer.
Yes. David, you're nodding there. What do you think?
About the gender side in
Yeah.
particular. Yeah, I mean, it is a very gendered environment, it seems to me. I mean, you watch a bit of the television coverage, it's all about the frocks and that kind of thing. And as Catherine suggests, a lot of drinking, usually an emphasis on sparkling wine or champagne, so that it's a bit classy. And yeah, a curious world, I think, racing is, because it has a very masculine dimension and a very class dimension as well. So, the whole idea, the sport of kings, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So it's almost aristocratic, but of course it has also had this strong proletarian or working class support, particularly amongst men. I mean, I come from Britain, and it's little known that when I was growing up, and I've never been much of a gambler, but I did know that the Morning Star, the Communist Party newspaper, had the best coverage of racing of any newspaper in Britain. Because now you think it might be a bit odd that the Communist Party would be so keen on racing, but it was one way of connecting with working class men
Yes.
in particular. So I think gamblers themselves have typically been positioned as men, and I think if you only have to look at the latest online gambling, it's targeted largely at young men and their capacity to gamble as a form of cultural capital, masculine cultural
Yes.
capital, essentially.
Yes, thank you. Back to you, Catherine. If we look at your work more broadly, what have you discovered in examining how cultural rituals reinforce identity and belonging and gender stereotypes?
Well, that's a big question. I think um, I think maybe the way I'll answer this is talk about some of the work I did. I did for 15 years with the National Rugby League, where I worked largely pro bono as a gender advisor, but I did 3 large research projects with a team of people into the off-field culture of rugby league. And on the basis of the data that we collected through surveys and interviews, we designed and evaluated education programs that are a way of engaging the guys, not just lecturing them. And so rugby league, is a very working class sport, and there's a lot of gambling in it. In fact, one of the things on the Wellbeing and Education Committee we looked at was the relationship between drug use, alcohol, gambling, and then adverse consequences for women, if I can put it euphemistically. But I saw over that period of time a real shift in the culture, and in fact, we measured it. And one of the big influences on changing that framing and that sort of ritualistic culture was taking seriously women's sport. So
Yes.
when I first arrived with the rugby league in 2004, I think I was watching a state of origin game, which is a big, important game in the league, in a corporate box. And a guy who was probably a barrister from the eastern suburbs, I said to him, wouldn't it be great to have a women's state of origin? And he looked at me. He was a bit squiffy, I think. And he said, that's ridiculous. You're dreaming. And I said, why's that? And he said, women can't play body contact sport, and pointed to my breasts. And I said, well, you punch me in the breasts and I'll kick you in the balls and we'll see who's in more pain. And, and guess what? We now have a women's league, and, it's much loved by the fans.
Yes.
And it's really taken off. And when we look at women's sport in Australia, look at the Matildas. I mean, it was one of their games in the World Cup was one of the most watched TV events in Australian history. So I think that one of the things that is shifting, and this is where gender comes into it, is there has been an ongoing questioning of the blokey culture, the code of silence,
Yes.
all of those sorts of things in Australian sport. And Australian sport, as David knows better than me, is actually a cultural crucible, I think, when it comes to as a litmus test for changing social attitudes and norms.
Yes. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. David, would you like to add some commentary there at all?
Yeah, there has been a big change, I think, in the gender dynamic within sport in general. Probably horse racing a little less than most. I mean, there are trainers, I suppose, the kind of Gay Waterhouse time. There's Michelle Payne, famously, the female jockey that won the Melbourne Cup in 2015. But more broadly, across sport, very big changes. I mean, I don't think it's entirely a matter of good old social progress and enlightenment. I mean, to some degree, you could say that the men's sport market was pretty much saturated, and I'm not a marketer, but I would not exclude the majority of the population from having a deep engagement with whatever it is I'm trying to sell. And I think sport has been part of that expansion, really, of the economy of sport, the global economy of sport. And so women have been included, I mean, in the first instance as spectators. Well, probably before that in amateur sport as, the mothers who, made the sandwiches and cut up the oranges and ferried the kids around and that kind of thing. So as supporters of the infrastructure of sport, then increasingly as spectators, and now as participants. I was watching, for example, the Women's World Cup rugby union in Britain, won, I'm pleased to say, by the English team. And I mean, an enormous crowd, just as there was for the Matildas. But also, I think in the case of rugby union, a sport where body shapes are many and varied and don't clearly fit with traditional conceptions of femininity and attractiveness, and then to see these women fated as champion and as champion athletes, not just as women
Yes.
dressed up as athletes.
Yes. Yes. So I think it sounds like you believe that progress is happening, potentially in other realms, with hopefully horse racing to follow at some point. How do you think that could evolve? Catherine, you look like you're about to
Well,
comment.
I just wanted to respond to something David said.
Yes.
Yes, David, of course, you touched on the very important point that, I sound a bit Pollyanna-ish saying, isn't this fantastic, all this inclusion? I mean, obviously part of what's driving this is this global late capitalist engine, which is, now frame sport. And to your point, David, Peter V'landys, who is now the head of the Rugby League Commission and who effectively now runs the game, he's a very dominant figure. Well, he came out of racing, and the reason I stopped working, or I stopped being their gender advisor, was that when he came in, he was really not a great fan of the sort of work that I'd been doing, I think. And in fact, he did tell a journalist that I was an attention seeker at one point. This was on the back page of the sports page, which is sort of the front page of the sports page. And my response was, yes, I am an attention seeker. I seek attention for domestic violence, sexual assault, wherever it happens. But so he and I do not see eye to eye. And interestingly, one of his recent moves was to gather up rugby league teams and drop them into Las Vegas, which from the Wellbeing and Education Committee perspective is a bit of a nightmare because, I mean, where are you going to find a lot of drugs, a lot of gambling, a lot of alcohol, and potentially consensual sexual encounters? Well, I think Las Vegas is a sure bet. But that's all about globalizing the game. And so that's what Peter V'landys is very good at, to give him his due. He's very good at the business side of sport. But to me, sport is much more than that. I mean, certainly rugby league is, a community.
Yes.
And that's a different dimension. The Melbourne Cup and racing, there is a tribalism in that as well. And that's a dimension of sport that I think sometimes comes into conflict with what people value about sport and why people follow teams or have certain loyalties.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. David, perhaps we might turn our attention to you now. And in terms of the Melbourne Cup as a Australian story, do you think we're ready to retire that story? Are we ready to move on? Or is it still holding on strong today in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a strong, I suppose, sacred dimension to sport. And only has to think of the Olympics and the whole idea of it having this spiritual dimension. The Olympics is a movement, not just a sport, as it likes to say. It's an ethic in it, and so on. And so the idea of the sacred being this is something that is above and beyond the miserable everyday world. That is the sacred. It takes me back to my sociology and of Emile Durkheim and the sacred and the profane. We spend most of our life in the world of the profane, and there is something that is separated from us, that is sacred, that is in some way intangible. And I think in terms of the Melbourne Cup in particular, there's this idea that being very Durkheimian here, what is being really celebrated in the Melbourne Cup is, well, Australianness, and particularly its masculine dimension, which dominates Australianness. And bit by bit, I think that has been eroded. When I first came to Australia, I'm a migrant. It was all, I sort of had to join in Melbourne Cup. I didn't know much about horse racing particularly, but I went along the office suite, all that kind of thing. Went along. I got a flat cap hat that I and wore it as if I was a bookie kind of thing. It was all good fun. But I've noticed in subsequent years that it's declined. I mean, it's empirically declined, for example, in terms of TV ratings. It's not up there. Certainly the free-to-air TV ratings have fallen. I've noticed there's less talk about it. There are fewer office sweeps. And a number of people are concerned about the animal cruelty side of it. And that was just something I think most of us didn't really consider very much until quite recently.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, David. Yes, that, um, there was a Four Corners program about, the cruelty to horses. And I mean, again, this just reflects, I think, changing ethics.
Yes.
The idea of having my SP bookie grandfather, they had a sort of semi that overlooked the race course in Newcastle. So you could sit on the veranda and watch the dish lickers, which was the greyhound racing there. And, again, greyhound racing, we know about the cruelty there,
Yes.
and we're living in a society that has very different standards. We're a wealthier society, and we've got, I think, more capacity to care about animal cruelty.
Yes.
This is, I think, a positive shift in values.
Yes. I agree.
Sorry, could I just jump in? I should have said I meant to about the whole push against gambling, in particular, online gambling. I've done quite a lot of work in recent years on gambling and gambling harm, and it's as well to remember that in June 2023, the late Peter Murphy, who chaired a Senate report, brought down findings, recommendations that this is often actually mistakenly reported. The official recommendation was that online gambling should be excluded from the media,
Yes.
the advertising of online gambling. Not all gambling advertising on television and in other places. I think she would have wanted that, but that wasn't a formal recommendation. But I think of that report. But there is, I think, a big push against gambling culture and the gamblification of sport and the cultivation of children as gamblers through
Yes.
the media. And of course horse racing is implicated in that, because horse racing essentially exists for gambling purposes. That's
Yes.
why it was invented.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. No, thank you.
So to say it's the opposite of sports that were formed so people could play sport and then they gambled on it. Horse racing is they formed it for gambling, and then people enjoyed the sport as a kind of secondary feature.
Yes. I mean, look, I think they're very healthy reflections. When I think of a sacred story, the area that I think we get into trouble in is when a sacred story becomes so precious that we can't interrogate it and we can't test it and we can't say, is this still valid or has it changed? And what I think I'm hearing is that actually we are shifting, our values are shifting, our ethics are shifting. And so I think the story naturally shifts with it. One of the things that I think goes hand in hand with the narrative of the Melbourne Cup is the value of mateship in Australian society. I'm interested to know from both of you if you think that's getting manipulated for the purpose of gambling advertising.
Well, I absolutely think so, yes. I think, look, I mean, I'm not in principle, my sort of feminist ethics is, doesn't suggest that mateship's a terrible thing. I mean, like all kind of forms of social bonding, it has a useful purpose. And, when I look at what we know about some of the downsides of conventional masculinity, we know that men are healthier and live longer if they do have male friends. So I'd be the last person to say, oh, it's awful if men get together at the pub or wherever they get together. But, there's certainly been a toxic side to mateship. And again, I'm going back to Newcastle. I mean, in the 1960s, when I was a little kid, my grandfather was unfortunately, like many men then, domestically violent. And, it involved the boys getting together at the pub for the 6 o'clock swill. And a lot of those men went home and hit their wives on a Friday night. And the police said it was a matter between a man and a wife. So, I'm not going to romanticize that old mateship culture because there was a lot of violence behind it. In the same way, you think about two up on Anzac Day, which is, again, a sort of sacred ritual, men at the pub, I mean, there aren't any, I don't know how many people who were in the Second World War, are around anymore. But, when you look behind that story, this is men bonding in trauma, really,
Yes.
after what they witnessed. And so, you don't have to scratch the surface very far to see a completely different narrative happening underneath that celebration.
Thank you. Anything from you on that, David?
Yeah, I mean, as as I mentioned, as a migrant, I was when I came to Australia, I was kind of initiated into mateship, or the Australian version of it.
Yeah.
There are versions of it in other cultures, of course, but it had a particular kind of force in Australia, and I always felt a bit uneasy about it. I didn't like being kind of, the academic term interpolated as a mate by people who I didn't really know. Well, I was quite pleased once when someone called me Cobber. That sounded. I'd never been called Cobber. I was walking down the street in Hobart, and there was a goat had escaped from someone's garden, and someone yelled at me, "Here, Cobber, is that your goat?" And that was a kind of, I was being kind of hailed a bit as a mate there, Cobber mate, that kind of thing. And it is quite seductive in a way. And I think particularly for young men, which is what the gambling ads
Yes.
really get onto with sport, is that it's all settled, sitting around in the pub, all mates together, and they occasionally kind of bring in a woman to you know, for one reason or another. Actually, many years ago, I wrote a chapter with a colleague, Karen Gilmore, on ads of this kind, with and their masculinity, the mateship, and the awkward treatment of women. That's changing a little bit, not that much, but I noticed that the latest data is that, again, going with my previous rather pessimistic comments, that they've now, the marketers, advertisers have discovered that actually there is quite a big market amongst young women for online sports gambling too, which is starting to move a bit away from the mates. And then, I don't know, and then the mate is essentially a masculine figure, but then there are female mates, and that kind of changes the dynamic.
Well, David and Catherine, thank you both for your reflections. I wonder if I could ask you something in summary and in closing, perhaps, which is just around where we have these events like the Melbourne Cup, and we know that there's both a fundamental part of Australian history at the foundations, but layers of complexity and things that we may want to replace with something different. What does the best case scenario look like for our cultural and sporting traditions as we move forward? What do we want to keep, and what do we want to kind of maybe put to rest?
Well, I mean, one of the things I'd say is I'm always careful not to be what Australians call a wowser, right? Like the fun police, because
Yes.
I mean, I think there's too much of that at times. We've got to distinguish, I think, between what is truly unethical and harmful to individuals or harmful to other groups of people, and the fact that, we should be able to let our hair down and, maybe have a punt, maybe have a glass of champers or a schooner, dress up. Women can dress up, men can dress up. I think all of that's, part of life. So I certainly don't want to be a dampener on that stuff. But I think the broadening of sport with increasing the participation of women is really positive, because I think also this is a broader thing I've been thinking about in a book I'm writing at the moment, and maybe I'm an optimist, but there is a movement, a return to connected communities. In an era where we're saturated with social media, we're saturated with this kind of with algorithms that are driving us down rabbit holes, etc. We've lost a lot of the things that bound us as a community, or bind us. So, I mean, whether it's church, whatever you think of religion, whether it's community organisations, there is now a movement of renewal for community. And sport does have a very important role to play in that. Again, with my Newcastle family, who I see a lot of, rugby league's huge. My lovely aunt who died, her coffin was draped in the Knights regalia, her team.
Yeah.
So sport can play a very positive role in bringing people together. And I think there's a pushback against this commercialisation and this globalisation that David referred to among grassroots fans. So I don't know what shape I can give that, but I mean, I think that there is a movement in the opposite direction to the sort of late capitalist framing of sport.
Yes. Lovely. Thank you. David.
I think, like pretty much everyone who works in the field of popular culture, as I've done for most of my academic life, I was a bit ambivalent about my object of study. I mean, my PhD was actually on the popular music industry, the rock music industry in Britain, and the post-punk era, and I kind of drifted into sport. But there are obvious connections between pop music and sport. Indeed, I wrote a book on it. My first book was on that very subject. And so there's always this bit of ambivalence, like bridling against people who dismiss sport from some elevated, high-class position. So I'm critical of that. On the other hand, I'm critical of the of the over-romanticization of sport
Yes.
as sacred, as above and beyond the,
Yes.
the rest of the world. So, we're kind of essentially trying to play both sides of the line. One thing I've never wanted to do in sport, and even probably in horse racing, although maybe I'm moving a bit in the other direction, but I've never been keen on the idea that it shouldn't happen, that the world would be a better place if there was no sport. I don't believe that's the case. I think it's been blighted in many ways and misused. But as Catherine points out, there's a lot to like about it in terms of participation, in terms of fandom. I mean, I have my own deeply irrational love of Plymouth Argyle Football Club, who play in the not in one of the higher divisions of the English Football League, but I love them, and they're a great way of connecting with other people, both people I like and unfortunately people I don't so much like, which is the fate of any kind of fan. So I think sport has a lot going for it. It's something that needs to be protected. One of the things that I have argued about in terms of social policy, which it is to argue in favour of the and it's a bit technical, the anti-siphoning list. That is, that Australia mandates there are certain events of national importance and cultural significance. They're all sports events, and they must be protected for free-to-air viewing. And I support that that notion, because I do think that if we're going to have festivals of nation, then everyone should have access to them rather than be a condition of their capacity to pay a subscription. So there are all kinds of, I think, pros and cons about sport, which is why I think it's such a fascinating object for engaged analysis, which is what I've kind of built a career on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, David and Catherine, both. Wonderful insights and shared wisdom from both of you. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure getting to know you. I
Thank
think
you.
it's a great podcast. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I hope you're enjoying the second series of Sacred Stories of the Spirit. This season, conversations traverse change, identity, and belonging, and they ask us how to live with more integrity, more courage, and more connection, both to ourselves and each other. Together, we're looking at what it means to live story as practice, to let story guide our healing, our growth, and our understanding of what's possible in the day-to-day. Stay with us as we journey through the landscapes of courage, authenticity, and transformation. My next guest in this part of the conversation is Clancy Moore, who's the CEO of Transparency International Australia. Clancy's work is not about the Melbourne Cup directly, but it reveals the political and economic ecosystem that helps sustain the social permission around it. Events like the Cup don't just coexist with gambling in Australian culture, they kind of function as an emotional shield. By wrapping gambling in the language of fun, novelty, and harmless workplace tradition, what Transparency International's research shows is the machinery behind that shield, the lobbying power, the revolving door appointments between politics and gambling interests, and the policy influence that keeps public sentiment from translating into structural change. Well, Clancy, thank you so much for joining me. Tell me a little bit about Transparency Australia.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. So Transparency International Australia is a not-for-profit organisation. We had our 30th birthday this year,
Happy birthday.
and our mission is to shine a light on corruption, but also work proactively with different stakeholders to put forward solutions that create a society that's more transparent, free from corruption, and really for Australia to have, a better place for all Australians to live.
Fantastic. How do you think your work and your role plays into the well-being of Australia generally? How do you hope to be effective?
Yeah, a lot of people, when they think about corruption, they think, brown paper bags, bribes under the table, businessmen doing bad things, which it is. But actually, corruption impacts all Australians through a waste or misuse of public money for projects that, don't go anywhere, or white elephants, to the undue influence that certain private interests or rich individuals have on how policies are made that affect all Australians. If we look at climate change as one example, the fossil fuel lobby has been active in their advocacy and lobbying, and sometimes undue influence to stop action on climate, and that impacts all Australians. And similarly with the gambling reform area, well, it's not corruption per se, but we know that undue influence or an uneven playing field exists that allow, the gambling sector to kind of really have a lot of power over what happens in Canberra. and how policies are made that affect all of us.
Yeah, thank you. With the Sacred Stories of the Spirit podcast, I have people that listen from different parts of the world, and I know that you're part of a global organization. So how do you think this plays out globally? Do you think these are the same issues that are present in other countries in terms of the gambling and, the resources sectors?
So there are 100 Transparency International chapters around the world. We call them chapters or organizations, but we're all united in our vision of seeing a world free from corruption. While corruption is really an abuse of entrusted power for private or personal gain, it does differ from country to country. And I think what is common across all countries is that power can corrupt, and ultimately it's citizens and everyday people that suffer from the impacts of corruption. But the industries involved, the individuals involved often differs from different contexts and regions.
Okay. So we are going to focus on Australia and New Zealand today for this specific conversation, because this is about the Spring Racing Carnival, which is something that Australians and New Zealanders know well,
Yep.
which culminates in the Melbourne Cup. And so really what I want to talk to you about today is some of the research that you've done over the past couple of years into the gambling sector and into lobbying at the federal level of government. So I wonder if you could start by telling me about the 2023 research that you did into the gambling sector.
So in 2023, we put out a piece of research called Picking a Winner, and it looked at how the gambling sector uses lobbyists, primarily paid lobbyists, so consultancies or third parties, to influence how legislation, how laws are made and how political decisions are made. We did use some research from Melbourne Uni academic Jen Lacey-Nichols as well. And what we found was that since 2011, at least 8 former federal ministers and senior advisors, including those that actually had responsibility for regulating the gambling sector, and even a premier, ended up working for gambling industries or the peak body after leaving politics. Some of them almost immediately after leaving politics as well. So this is what we call the revolving door, where you see former politicians or advisors, senior advisors, leave politics and kind of parachute into a really well-paid lobbying job, often in industries where they used to have responsibility for regulating. And this is a real issue. It's a real problem because former politicians make great lobbyists, right?
Yeah, they know their way around.
They know their way around. They know who to call. They know how legislation is made. They have access to other politicians, contracts, contacts, you name it, they've got it. And, they're very effective lobbyists. And this makes it really hard for other groups, community groups, maybe non-government organisations, to have their voices heard. We also found that the gambling sector in particular has access to lots of those third-party lobbying firms. So these aren't, for example, a government relations person who works for a gambling company. These are kind of gun-for-hire lobbying firms. Their job is to work for a client to get an outcome. And our research showed that the gambling sector had used 13 individual lobbying firms at the federal level to influence policy. And this gave those gambling interests a huge number or army of paid lobbyists to do their business in Canberra, to walk the halls of Parliament, meeting politicians behind closed doors, often in secret, to kind of put their case forward. And I would argue that this has a kind of corrupting influence on how policy is made in Australia.
Yeah, interesting. So as I was saying before we started recording, my interest here is where we look at things like the Spring Racing Carnival and the Melbourne Cup, where we have really big participation, and particularly in workplaces where we have, people doing sweepstakes and parties. And in Melbourne, you get the day off to go and, spend your money and participate quite fulsomely, really. So it really does feel like it's encouraged. We're encouraged by our government, by our business organisations, by, commercial interests to go and do this thing. And what I'm really interested in knowing or wanting is that people really understand what's going on. And for me, I think if you're participating in an event like that, and there's fun and it's the opportunity to be connected and have a relaxing day, that's all great. But the underbelly is what worries me. And I think that a lot of people don't really understand what's going on here, in the sense that there is this kind of what feels to me quite sinister machinations going on behind the scenes. So tell me about what kind of policies you're talking about that they may have influenced, because what I'm thinking is policies around advertising, policies around the presence of gambling in our society generally. And I think, it's for me, I can see people just groaning and sighing here, saying, oh, it's just another thing that I have to think about. It's another thing that I have to be responsible for in terms of understanding how lobbyists are working and understanding how government is working. And I just want to have fun. But I think it's really important that we are transparent and that your work is kind of understood and heard in what you're uncovering. So can you talk to me about how that might affect the everyday person who may not be aware that those policies impact them and their families and children?
Yeah, of course. Look, there's a well-known link between problem gambling and harm for communities. If we look at the pokies or clubs, as they're called in New South Wales, are disproportionately located in lower socioeconomic areas and have a larger harm on low-income communities, people already at risk as well. There's also a clear link between problem gambling and suicide, particularly in young males. This is really distressing stuff for all Australians. And, as a father of two boys, I don't really like watching the football and seeing gambling ads pop up before the game
Exactly.
as
Yeah.
part of normal coverage, right? And then my kids are asking me about odds and
Yeah.
what different gambling terms mean. It's almost becoming kind of normalized. So I think there's a real harm that's being caused by a lack of regulation around some of these industries. And it's unfortunate that often the root cause of these problems are how laws are made. Sorry, I should probably explain that a bit more. But laws guide behaviour and kind of set the rules. And
Yeah.
what determines how the rules in Canberra are made in our federal parliament is how politics and how lobbyists are regulated. And if you look at lobbying regulations or even political donations, you've got a situation where rich individuals or private interests have a huge advantage over community groups, citizens, and other interests. And this is done through that lobbying kind of revolving door, also the access to paid lobbyists, but also through political donations. So political donations to the major parties, so Labor and then the coalition Liberal National parties, from gambling lobbying groups have gone up about 600% in the last decade. If we look at data from 2023, 2024, donations from alcohol and gambling companies to political parties were about $2.5 million. So this sort of cocktail of, pay to play, cash for access, and sort of the revolving door of private sector and politics, it's really hard to combat. And I kind of feel sorry for politicians, to be honest, because they're getting bombarded by all these lobbyists from different interests, and they're
Yeah.
probably getting influenced because that's all they're hearing. They're only hearing one side of the story at times. So
Yeah.
it is something that we're acutely aware of as a research organisation or an NGO and advocacy organisation. But I think Australians do care deeply about when they find out about these stories and how it does harm everyday Australians.
Yeah. So you've now put out a report that, has identified how lobbying is not really being regulated at the federal level. And gambling is one of the real highlights there, where we see how many ministers and political people have actually gone to work in the lobbying sector. Do you think that we should be angry at the federal government or angry at the way that politics works? I mean, how should we take this research or these insights, and what should we do with them, really?
Yeah. Look, I think lobbying it's a part of the political process, right? Like, I'm a lobbyist. I go to Canberra sometimes. I talk to politicians, but the current rules have got so many loopholes. They clearly favour wealthy and private interests, and something needs to change. So, I think Australians want to see greater transparency. They want to see big business not having as much impact in how policies are made. They want to see politicians doing the right thing, and they want to see fairness and kind of integrity in how laws are made, hopefully benefit all Australians. So, I mean, some of the really simple things that could happen, I think for a start, if ministers were to publish their diaries, who they met with and what they discussed, that would be
Yeah.
a good start. We could also stop the revolving door by having, for example, a 3-year cooling off period or a 3-year kind of ban on ministers and senior public servants leaving politics and taking lucrative jobs for private interests where they used to regulate those interests. That would also help as well.
Yeah.
And also greater transparency and regulations of political donations would also make a difference and help restore Australians' trust as well. I think there's a big issue with, people's trust of how government works right now. And that doesn't benefit anyone. That kind of polarizes the debate, right? So anything that can help build trust and build transparency and integrity in the system is going to be a benefit for all Australians.
Yeah. How did you find the response to the report that you've just put out about the revolving door? And how present do you feel this conversation is in the Australian dialogue? Do we care enough about transparency?
I think Australians care a lot about transparency. I think we care about fairness. We care about integrity. We want things to be fair for all. We don't like to see the little guy or little person kind of be hard done by. And unfortunately, with gambling, it affects the little person. It affects people that are already on the fringes of society generally, those lower socioeconomic groups as well. So I think people know the harm. And the research we put out was a couple of years ago, but it was really well received. We also put out research just recently which analysed different states and territories and how they regulate lobbyists, and it's had a really big impact. So we had coverage in ABC. We had Senator David Pocock in the federal parliament talk about the research, and we've briefed quite a few members of parliament, including the government, on the research and what needs to happen to have a level playing field and have a political system and a lobbying set of rules that is free from undue influence and corruption.
Yeah, nice. Do you think that people understand the role of lobbyists generally?
Like I said, lobbying is a part of the political process, but there is definitely a perception that's based on evidence that the rules are kind of rigged, that it's kind of stacked against the everyday Australian. I think that's generally the perception. And, that the power of private interests, whether it's tech bros or big tech like Google and Amazon and Meta, or, private interests like the mining sector or the gambling sector, have too much sway over how decisions are made.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of something that's kind of ever present in people's psyche. And yeah, I think Australians do care deeply about it.
Tell me, what can everyone kind of have a think about in terms of how they hold governments accountable, how they hold industry and private sector accountable? What are the best things to do?
I think if you care deeply about our democracy, the rules that govern how legislation and laws are made, if you want to do something about it, just do it. Donate to a registered charity or an advocacy organisation, write a letter to your politician, request a meeting with your politician, write a letter to the paper, share something on social media. I think we've all got agency and we can all make a difference. And if you do care, well, do something about it.
Very good. Thank you, Clancy. I really appreciate your time.
No worries. Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jordan.
If you're new to Sacred Stories of the Spirit, you might like to go back and listen to Series 1 of the podcast, where the journey began. In this first series, we explore the transformative power of story and how the act of sharing, reflecting, and reframing our experiences can help us make sense of who we are. So if you haven't already, I invite you to take a listen, and hopefully you'll find something in each episode that's timeless, whether it's an insight, a question, or just a moment of recognition and reflection. Enjoy. We come to a moment when a protected story can no longer conceal its cost. My next guest is Elio Solotto, who is the campaign director of the Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses. His work was central to the 2019 act that revealed the widespread cruelty and large-scale slaughter of racehorses. This was a moment that fundamentally ruptured our assumption that the Cup was a harmless celebration, and it was the first time many Australians saw behind the curtain of the cultural story of the Cup, and it triggered a reckoning that couldn't be folded back into nostalgia. Elio is documenting what happens when the emotional myth of a ritual collides with the living consequences of it. This is when a ritual stops becoming symbolic and starts becoming ethical terrain. Well, Elio, thank you so much for joining me. I feel really honoured and delighted to be able to chat with you, really. I think you've done such incredible work. So thank you.
No,
This is
it's
awesome.
a pleasure.
So I'm really interested in your journey. Tell me about your personal journey being a voice and an advocate for animals, particularly horses bred for racing.
Yeah, well, I got involved with animal rights a long time ago, and I became part of a group that would do rescues of chickens, pigs, all kinds of animals, and also exposed the cruelty, especially in factory farms. And horse racing was something that was in the back of my mind that whole time. But I guess for me, the focus was definitely factory farming because that involved the most amount of animals and the most cruelty. Like, everyone should know that the average chicken only lives for 6 weeks before they're slaughtered for their meat. And so that was something that became a big part of my life, I guess, and still is today, believing that animals are really no different in their ability to feel pain to humans, and they should be given the respect to be able to live out the lives that's, that is natural to them, not what benefits humans. And so horses came into it back in the early 2000s. It was about 2005, I think, 2006. And we were called out to a rabbit farm that there was some horrific things happening at this rabbit farm. And coincidentally, that same day, we received a phone call from a woman who had concerns about some horses. And it was actually on the way to this rabbit farm. And so we decided we'd go and investigate it. And I had no idea about horse racing at the time. I'd actually even gone to the races a few times. And I think I had my blinkers on, pardon the pun, as a lot of people do. And I had a good time, but I guess if I was true to myself, I knew that there was obviously going to be cruelty behind what they show you at the races. And so we went to this place and discovered that where we were was actually an abattoir, or actually a knackery, where they kill horses for dog meat and for animals at the zoo, as well as all kinds of other animals. And I found myself standing in a pen full of horses, and these horses could hardly move, and they're all really gentle and well behaved. And I'm wondering what the hell these horses were doing there. And these horses a lot of them looked really well maintained, in contrast to what we were told about from this neighbour. But obviously we found out later that there were other horses in the paddock that were really poorly kept. And these horses were there, we discovered, were solely there because they couldn't earn any more money for their owners. And I was kind of horrified and realised there was a very pivotal moment that I decided that I can't turn my back on these animals. And so that led to an ongoing investigation at this particular knackery that expanded to other knackeries and slaughterhouses. And then we decided to form the Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses for a couple of reasons. One, because I felt that every animal deserves to be defended, and certainly horses were not the ones that were that were treated the worst, both in terms of numbers relatively low, but it was really important that we be a voice for all of them. And secondly, I thought that if people can make the connection to a horse, it's much easier, I think, to connect to cats and dogs and animals like horses. They'll make that connection with other animals, other species that we commonly eat. And so that led to the formation of our organisation. And we've been investigating it ever since, and we've been lobbying governments and the racing industry itself and making people aware of what really goes on in the racing industry, which is horrific.
Yeah. It's incredible work. And starting the Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses and inspiring others to do the work and doing the work yourself, it's no small thing. That's a big part of your life you've dedicated to this work. What are some of the trials and tribulations of the journey for you?
Look, I started off, even with people within our movement, saying, Elliot, do you really think you can make a difference, with horse racing? And my gut feel was that I have to at least try.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to I don't want to go to my deathbed one day knowing that I knew all this and did nothing about it. And so I just thought I'm just going to do the best I can. I think you just have to start, and gradually people come on board because they can see something that they couldn't see before. And so anybody that truly cares about animals would not support horse racing. And I felt that not only was it important to do this, but I felt that it was a campaign that we could achieve good results because it was so much in the public eye, that there were so many, there was video replays of the races. It was commonly accepted that horses go to become dog meat, to become glue. So all those stories I felt like needed to be told, and I didn't think it was going to be hard to do because the racing industry somehow got this free pass to exploiting these innocent animals. And I felt that all that had to happen was for it to be exposed, and that people would see that it is cruel and would turn against it. And I think we've seen significant change since then.
Yeah. I know that you're also a builder. Was it funny to you to find yourself doing this, having kind of come up through the ranks of the building industry?
No, look, not at all. I mean, I consider myself first and foremost an activist, and I consider that to be my real job. I was lucky enough my father was a builder. I was lucky enough to find something that I really like to do. So going to work was really like playing with Lego blocks for me. It was just something that was fun. It didn't even feel like work.
Yeah.
I find that the real work is the animal activism, where it's tiresome. It's stressful, but I couldn't see myself not doing it. It's something that gives purpose to my life. And I think when you've got purpose to your life, you find the time and the energy to do these things when you're actually doing it not for yourself. And I think I've been really lucky that it's done as much for me as what I have done for the movement. And it's not just me; it's thousands of people every day that are doing things, and I applaud every single one of them. Even people that go to demonstrations and face the wrath of, our demonstrations can be quite noisy and not violent, but they can be quite noisy, as many people see it as an affront for us to be challenging their views. But at the same time, we talk to a lot of people in the racing industry, and I have no ill feeling towards these people. I'm sorry that they do what they do and they can't see what they do. But showing empathy for these people who often it's been a career for them that maybe extended from their own parents and grandparents. It's very difficult to make somebody see the errors of what they're doing. And certainly, it's been an interesting journey, but one that I'm really glad to have embarked on.
Yes. I wonder, the things that you must have seen are not things I imagine are easy for anyone to see. The cruelty and the first-hand experience of seeing the horses in the state that they have been in some of the places you've gone. How have you managed yourself through that journey?
Yeah, look, I think it's a common problem amongst animal activists that expose themselves to the cruelty and the horrors of how these poor animals are treated. And you need to compartmentalize the work that you do. And I've seen lots of animal activists get burnt out, and I've been lucky that I've had my building work. We'd often take time off to do my animal rights work, which I can do because I'm self-employed. And I would just, shut down a site for sometimes 2 weeks if I had to, if it meant that something needed to be done. So I'm lucky that I can still do that work and take a break. I think it's really important to not let it swallow up your entire way of life. And the cruelty that you see, it's not something that you ever forget, but it's something that helps you drive you to keep going, which is really important.
Yeah, amazing. I think for me, and probably for many, many people across the Asia Pacific region, the darkest hours were when the ABC 7:30 report aired the final race, which was in 2019 on the night before the Melbourne Cup. How did you feel when that report came out? And you were part of it. You were,
Yeah. That was part of a investigation that took the best part of maybe 2.5 years from the initial investigation, reconnaissance that we did. That was just something that we kept on plodding away at and plodding away. And we didn't even know whether it was ever going to actually be shown on TV. And as it turned out, we're very lucky to have Caro Meldrum Hanna, who was the journalist, who was 100% behind it, who managed to do the most magnificent job in exposing the horrors of what happens to these horses after racing. And she could not have done a better job. To see that footage on TV that was taken over 2.5 years, and we had people that were going through that footage. Often there were 7 or 8 cameras set up at the same time. So in order to do the work that we did, there were several people that were looking over that footage, hours and hours and hours of footage, and documenting the horses through, because we needed that evidence. And so for me to see that on TV, it was people ringing me up, telling me I'm really sorry about, when I in fact was ecstatic that it was on TV.
Yeah.
So what we had seen was finally out there in public, and it's still going on, unfortunately, but it will be exposed again until it's finally got rid of. The work continues.
Yeah. It felt to me that was a major shift. I think I really felt a shift in the perception of racehorsing from, people around me, and an understanding of really what was going on. But I'm curious to know what you think and how much you think has changed. It's been 6 years since then. That's probably the biggest expose that I know of that's come out about, the industry. Do you think things have substantially and positively been changed for good?
Yeah, look, I think definitely that was a turning point, but also what was an earlier turning point were the 5 or 6 horses that died in the Melbourne Cup. People just weren't aware that that horses die in racing. In fact, a Death Watch report comes out shortly, and I think there's over 180 horses that have been killed in training or on the racetrack that we know of. But we know that there's many, many more. There are, literally thousands of horses that are killed either because they're sustain injuries or because they can't compete. And often they become uncompetitive because of injuries that they sustain. They suffered from all kinds of internal injuries like bleeding in the lungs, musculoskeletal injuries, heart attacks. There's so much wrong with the way racing is run that the last consideration really is the horse. So I think that was a turning point. And then definitely the doco that came out by 7:30 definitely did change everything. It became common knowledge. We were routinely being abused online. I would be getting phone calls telling us that we're lying about the numbers of horses that are killed. And we knew that the numbers were true. We investigated every knackery in Victoria and several in New South Wales. We knew the numbers were right, but we were waiting for the right time to put it all together as proof. And since then, I have not been challenged. We haven't been challenged once about the numbers that have been killed. And so it's good to know that even people in the industry are aware. And we receive tip-offs from people in the racing industry telling us about horses that are killed that we wouldn't otherwise know about, horses that have failed in track work, have broken down. There are so many horror stories, and even I feel like we only know the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about on this podcast is old story versus new story. And I really want to celebrate the fact that you have brought into being this incredible, beautiful new story. So where we think of the old story being with the Melbourne Cup, the race that stops the nation, I mean, that's a little bit marketing spin, but it is also part of, historically component of Australian culture. And now I think we're really seeing a shift where a lot of people aren't taking on that story anymore. They're not doing Melbourne Cup the same way. There's more thought behind, the harms behind the day and the spring racing carnival altogether. And we're seeing this beautiful nut to the cup tradition evolve and become more and more known. And that's really something that I think you guys can be so incredibly proud of. But tell me how that started and what you think you're seeing in terms of the shift in behaviours.
Yeah, well, we thought the thing in the animal rights movement is that we're always putting out the bad news and telling people what they shouldn't be doing. People don't like to be told what they shouldn't be doing. And we had exposed the cruelty, and we felt like we needed to put a positive spin on the day. It's a public holiday, and many people who care about animals never celebrated Melbourne Cup because it is animal exploitation. And we actually received an email from somebody saying, hey, you guys need to do something on Melbourne Cup Day and make it positive and have an event that people can enjoy without the animal cruelty. And she said, maybe she called it Nut to the Cup. And it was as simple as that. Straight away, I said, yeah, let's do it. That was back in, I think, 2010. And, we've seen it grown since then. And now our objective is to, whilst people want to support horse racing and enjoy that, let them do that. For people that really care about animals, there's an alternative there. They can get together with your friends. It can be, a few friends. It can be, a large number of people. Organise an event, have a great day, perhaps put some money together and give it to an animal charity of your preference, because all these animal charities out there, they're all doing it tough and they could all use a helping hand. And so by getting people together, they can snub the Melbourne Cup and have a great day and feel good about helping animals.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. I love our conversation. And I wonder, first of all, how much work is left to be done? And also, where can listeners go to find out more about all of the things that you do?
Well, I think the work won't be done in my lifetime, but the important thing is to see that positive change. And we're seeing it not just here in Australia, we're seeing it around the world. And I think we're all inspiring each other. We have the internet now and we find out what other groups are doing. Other groups are contacting us. And so I think there is a global shift, not just towards being kinder to animals, but the environment, and people are waking up. At the same time, I see things getting worse in some countries, but there's definitely something happening in the world that we're seeing this positive shift, and we're just a small part of it, but really happy to be there and being a voice for these animals. If people want to get involved, they can contact us at horseracingkills.com. Or nuttothecup.org. We'd love more and more people to get involved. We have a whole website dedicated to Nut to the Cup, so people can get involved. We show people how easy it is to get a small event or a large event put together, and we'll support them 100% of the way.
Well, thanks, Elio, for the conversation, and congratulations on all the incredible work that you continue to do.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you have enjoyed the first part of our two-part special series. I think what we've seen through the conversations today is that rituals don't just become untouchable by accident. They're held in place by a number of things, including memory, identity, and cultural affection, but they're also reinforced by political machinery, and that is something that we should be, being aware of. And once we can see the architecture behind the story, we're much more empowered to revisit the story itself and think about what is the next evolution of that story, and what is our role as being a participant in evolving that story after we've taken a pause at this threshold moment. So in part 2, we start to look at next steps. I hope you'll join me for another great conversation. And I want to thank my guests today for being part of this exploration of sacred stories. I'm your host, Jordan Harcourt Hughes, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.